I think it's important at the outset to note that a state-centered and a realist framework isn't always suited now for what's actually happening in the region. Specifically, it's true now that in the region, there are many states that are really only functioning in a de jure sense with borders that are de jure and not de facto observed. That's the first problem with a state-centered approach. Realism also tends to skirt how religious and identity can be part of governance and part of the public space. It also obscures how sub-state actors are increasingly affecting outcomes in the region. Realism isn't necessarily the best way for us to grasp historic memory and national myth that are also increasingly part of political identities and, which I think are fair to say, are defining strategic ambition for both state and non-state actors. So a strategy based only on realism is going to miss, and the state is going to miss some of these key dynamics that are actually current now in the region. So we need ways to understand also the diffusion of political and cultural movements across borders. That's not something that realism grasps easily. We need also to grasp these patterns of religious governance. And we also need some way to understand the interactions among Islamic and neighboring civilizations if we're going to develop an effective US strategy for the wider Middle East. In sum, I think we need to think beyond the state. We need to go beyond the assumptions of secular governance, and we have to go beyond fixed ideas of Western modernity. And we can't go to those places that we need to exclusively with a state-centered realist approach. We need to have state-centered realism in our foreign policy, of course, but it's not a sufficient approach. A more US effective strategy really relies on tools that get us beyond our self-limiting frame of state-centered realism for the region as it is today. Well, I think it's important to note from the start what a civilizational analysis is not. It's not an attempt to throw us back to some sort of 19th century Orientalist or colonialist framework. It's not an attempt to start ranking peoples in some order. That's not where we need to go when we reintroduce the concept of civilizational analysis. What civilizational analysis does is it provides an analytic framework, a conceptualization to grasp some of the non-state-centered and some of the pre-modern issues that continue to have salience and strategic relevance for the United States in the region. So civilizational analysis does not presume that there's an eradication of traditional society, some as modernization theories have often done in the US approach to the region. But we ask instead, with civilizational analysis, fundamental questions about the interaction between modern and pre-modern identities. We need to know how do ancient patterns and precedents in this wider Middle East echo into the contemporary Middle East. We need to also use civilizational analysis to get past the habitual use of palace elites and state-centered thinking about how we interact with complex societies. There was a long history of the United States in the region where we could simply subcontract a lot of our engagement in these societies to palace elites and not understand the fissures and the history and the identities that are salient below the palace and which are politically relevant. We're now in a place in the region where we must understand those things better. Specifically, a civilizational analytic approach can help us reckon with Islam as an enduring socio-political force. We cannot define it narrowly as extremism or reimagine it only as another form of secular politics or private religious observance. Civilizational analysis helps us grasp the broader role of Islam in the public sphere. We also get a better sense with civilizational analysis of how do specific states conceive of their interests and how do they act upon them in ways that are not necessarily discernible from just reading contemporary events and looking at their present day actions, you have to see how those actions are echoes of the past. For example, how does Egypt's fading bid for leadership in the Arab world reflect some of its identity as the civilization of the Nile and its unique self-perception in the Arab world? How does Syria's defense of the Eastern Mediterranean littoral indicate what it sees as its identity? And why is that still relevant? It's relevant because that's where the urban and productive part of the economy has always been based in the Eastern Med, and that's why they're protecting it. You get that from a civilizational analysis. How is Turkey's ambivalence toward the EU membership and NATO reflected in its historic pattern of always being an Anatolian plateau that seesaws between a European Western orientation and alternatively toward the Middle East? We're seeing that seesaw back into the Middle East. You grasp that pattern and precedent if you grasp civilizational analysis about the region. We also have to look at how the past in this region can affect the rebuilding of social compacts. If you have fragmented states in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, and you want to create new social compacts, it's very important to understand the underpinnings geographically, the divisions, the spaces that have to be incorporated into a modern polity, which in fact may not have been a normal boundary for these states. In fact, a lot of these states have divisions that are ancient and persistent, which modern social compacts have to reckon with if they are to succeed. North and South Yemen, Syria's upper Tigris-Euphrates and its Eastern Mediterranean littoral, Iraq's Sunni Shia and Kurdish divisions all have ancient, different geographic antecedents. Civilizational analysis also can give us ways to conceptualize the emerging state system. We're now in a period, a long process of going from that unipolar Ottoman Empire to a post-Ottoman, more multipolar order. We had the first attempt at governing that with the heavy Western 20th century influence in the region that's fading. And we need to understand systemically through civilizational analysis what kind of regional system is likely to emerge. So the role of religion, the role of national identity, systemic analysis, social compacts, all of that comes with a better understanding of civilizational analysis. I think that the first thing is, and this has been said by realists as well, we need to square our goals with our capabilities. The United States has had very large aims, and they've been fueled, I would argue, by a sense of preeminent post-Cold War US power and resources. That power advantage has significantly lessened, and that's the beginning of a current US strategy being rethought has to begin with squaring our goals with our capabilities. I think we also, thinking again in more civilizational terms, not exclusively in the state-centered realist framework that has governed our thinking, I think we need to base a new US strategy on the premise that for sure liberal ideas and institutions will continue to have a global appeal, including in the wider Middle East. However, these ideals and ideas will be sifted increasingly through the authority of the region's enduring ancient civilization. Iran's encounter, for example, with liberalism and Republican form of government is ongoing, and it's being sifted through its ancient, not only Persian identity, but it's also its identity as the seat of Shia Islam. And not to be forgotten, Iran also sees itself as having provided the civilizational grist to Sunni Islam in the early Abbasid medieval period. So Iran has a huge role to play, and it is sifting modernity through its ancient identities. This is true also of other states in the region, such as Egypt and Turkey, and to a lesser extent, Syria, I think. The new US strategy has to focus on the rebuilding of social compacts. And there are going to be, because if we've done our civilizational analysis correctly, we're going to be well aware that these social compacts will have to focus on key questions that have religious content. How can Islamic law, for example, complement Western sources of law? whether Republican forms of government can draw legitimacy from Islam's sacred texts or not, and how individual freedoms that we understand in the West can be understood or not, and legitimated or not in an Islamic religious context. So we're going to have to deal with these issues, and we're going to have to deal with them with a deeper sense of history than we previously have had. We also have to think about the system that is emerging in the Middle East in ways that, frankly, are informed by antecedents of unipolar and multipolar transition. We're moving to a more multipolar system. The basis of US interests in the region is going to have to look at where are the traditional nodes of power in this region? How are they dispersed? I would argue that it's helpful to go back to the fall of the Mediterranean Roman civilization for a little bit of understanding of what the underlying constituent parts of a new system in the region will be, again, informed by more civilizational analysis. Why Rome? Because Rome, when it finally did break up, it broke up into a Western European element, a Southern and Islamic and Arab element ultimately, and first Byzantium and now Turkey on the Anatolian plateau. Those are still fundamentally key conceptual bricks for building the new architecture of the region, and ones that are discernible and understandable through appreciation of civilizational analysis. And again, the larger relationship with Iran to US strategy will benefit by thinking not just along the 1979 antagonism that the United States and Iran are locking horns in and have been since 1979. But we need to have a little more sophisticated understanding about Iran's broader history of engagement with the Mediterranean world and the West. And we have to have an understanding also of Iran's Eastern focus toward places like Afghanistan and also into Central Asia. That doesn't come if you look at only a modernizing, secular, realist, state-centered approach. It comes from a broader and civilizational perspective. So that's how I think we need to reconsider the future US strategy in the region.